Okay. Thank you. Again, welcome to this conversation. My name is Eshpan Kwesiga, the Global Fund for Community Foundations. I'm based here in Kampala, Uganda, and thank you for joining us wherever in the world you are. So we're here today because many people in the international development system already agree, or many people that have interacted with the international development system already agree that there's something about the way monitoring and evaluation is done that doesn't already capture the complexities of how civil society organizations operate, and how communities choose to define success, as well as how attribution is arrived to. And because some of that complexity is not always captured, but also the traditional M&E systems can tend to be quite expensive if you're a small community-based organization that doesn't have the budgets to afford consultants to help you with your evaluation process. But it's also, fairly technical. It has a lot of jargon, and a lot of people might feel left out because of the jargon and the terminology that's involved in it. But we're also here because we acknowledge that. Yes, that the monitoring and evaluation system is expensive. It's filled with jargon. So we are here today to start a conversation on measuring what matters, or measuring differently, especially to measure in a manner that acknowledges horizontal accountability, because one of the other challenges of the international development system, or that the traditional monitoring and evaluation systems, is that they've always been conducted in a manner that values or prioritizes what matters to funders as opposed to what matters to communities. So we are here today to start a conversation on measuring in a style that acknowledges horizontal accountability in the same way that vertical accountability to funders has been valued over time. When I first got involved in this work, I thought to myself, finally, here is a group of people that hate log frames and indicators as much as I do. But I quickly learned that, yes, whilst part of this work is a critique of the existing system, that's only a small bit of it. That's just a fraction of a fraction. That the major part of the work is working together to build and to design or co-create an alternative system of measuring. And when we start to talk about alternative measuring, I feel that there are two things to keep at the back of our mind. The first is that in this room, there are no, well, there is a lot of expertise. It's important for everybody to remember that there are no experts. So nobody should ever feel that they need to come to these kinds of meetings prepared, or that they need to come with their expert hat on. The other is that the journey to co-create and design alternative systems involves essentially all of us holding each other's hand in the dark as we try to figure it out together. So we're here mostly to co-create and to talk about what it takes to build alternative forms of measuring, or alternative systems that measure what matters to communities. As I close, I want to say that when I started doing this work, it was a bit of a moving train. 2 years ago, the Global Fund did an interesting report on measuring what matters. And in a few seconds, I want to call in Jenny to tell us a little bit about that report, how it started, some of the thinking that went into it, as well as where we are right now, and to paint a picture of how we get to be here and how we've arrived here. Thank you for listening to me, Jenny.
Thank you, Eshpan. Hello, everybody. So this is round 2 of this conversation. We ran it earlier in the day, and we're hoping this one will be as good as the earlier one. We have Portuguese and Spanish interpretation now set up, I think, for those who would like to use that. So yes, as Eshpan said, this issue around measurement is something that we at the Global Fund for Community Foundations have been giving a lot of thought to over the past 5 or 6 years. Particularly, our experience was that working, oh, sorry, here's my cat. She also likes to measure what matters. Working with community philanthropy organizations around the world, so local funds and foundations that are close to or within the communities that they serve, that use small grants as a way to shift power and resources, and also that emphasize the role of philanthropy and local giving. And our sense was that these organizations were doing more than moving money, more than raising money and making grants. There was something, a story that lay behind the visible part of the story, if you like, that we wanted to understand. So we embarked on a journey back in 2018 where we invited members of our network to apply to be part of a learning cohort to look at measurement and meaning in their work. Our sense was that there was a lot of hidden stuff going on that was to do with building trust and relationships, what it meant to be a long-term place-based funder or a community-based funder, the insights that you got as a result of being there, the holistic approach that these organizations brought to their work and so on, and that it often just didn't fit the categories of more conventional types of monitoring and evaluation. Talking to our partners, we would often find that people would produce the data that they needed to present for the measurement and learning requirements or evaluation requirements of their donors, but actually they also kept their own sets of data, which was really what guided them in their own work, how they thought, what they learned about, and so on and so forth. So we brought together around 15 organizations who met once in South Africa in 2018 and again in Mexico in 2019 to start saying, well, what is the measurement story we want to tell? Who is this measurement and learning for? And how do we go about telling a very different story? Understanding that we need to account to those of us, those who've invested in our organizations, whether those are external or local, but understanding that measurement should be a 360-degree experience, and that really impact and learning, all those things, mattered most to the communities who they were meant to be serving in many ways. So the report, which Barry can say a little bit more about, was the coming together. It started with this group of 15 organizations starting to fundamentally think differently about what measurement, evaluation, and learning meant and what it could mean if it really was centered around communities and the people that our work, the people and movements that our communities serve. I think the idea that often monitoring and evaluation captures only a partial piece of the picture, and it's often the piece of the picture that is associated with external money and what that buys, was one of the sort of initial observations, and that often the sort of root system, the invisible part of the iceberg of what was really going on beneath the surface, somehow didn't get captured. So it was in that spirit that we started to kind of embed some of these ideas about what was the alternative story we wanted to tell, and who else wanted to be part of this conversation. And this led to the report that Eshban has mentioned, Measuring What Matters, and really the sense of opportunity that other ways of doing this are possible. I always like to mention this quote from James Gustav Speth, who is an environmental economist, who says, we tend to get what we measure, so we should measure what we want. And I think that's just an essential principle of this work, is making sure that the measurement of what the things that we're measuring is actually related to the things that we're actually setting out to do, and is not a separate exercise, which is really aimed at kind of gaming and ensuring and complying with a system that doesn't necessarily ask the right kinds of questions that we want to answer. Eshban, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Jenny. So the Measuring What Matters report, which I've just shared in the chat, was co-authored by Barry Knight, who's also here. So Barry, I would like to bring you in right now to tell us a little bit about what were some of the major insights and reflections for you, having been involved in writing this report. And maybe we shall also use that as a segue to introduce Deepthi, who will be joining us in this conversation to tell us a bit about her experiences experimenting and designing new forms of measuring. Barry.
Well, I'm just starting from where Jenny left off, really. This was a journey of exploration across the world. And although the report was written by two people, Dana Doan who founded the Lin Center in Vietnam, and me, we were just simply the authors of a whole crowdsourced set of views from across the world. The Global Fund collaborated with Candid, formerly known as the Foundation Center, and PSJP, who also ran some seminars and webinars on this topic. And we visited South Africa, as Jenny mentioned, and Mexico, but also Brazil, Serbia, Canada, the United States, Russia. We held monthly Zoom calls where we would report our progress, and there was a learning circle that formed around that helped us to co-create the report. We also did some academic literature searches so that we could try and be as comprehensive as possible. And what really struck, I suppose, the most outstanding point of the finding was that there are two kinds of evaluations, really. There is the one that I have spent most of my life doing, which is the top-down evaluation, where you look at a design system and say, is it working? And how do you know that? And the tools of statistics and qualitative analysis really come into their own there, because you've got a thing there. You can actually see, well, what does it do? How does it do it? What does it achieve? And all those kinds of things. But the field of community philanthropy is very different from that. Rather than being designed, it's emergent, it's growing, it's coming out of nothing, it's beginning to build systems and relationships and connections and building assets, capacities and trusts that don't previously exist. So you're actually building stuff from the grassroots, and you need a different kind of way of measuring. So it's not as if one paradigm is wrong and the other one is right. These two fit together, but they need to be used appropriately. And I often used to think of Rita Thapa, who was the founder of Tewa in Nepal, a women's fund that transmogrified into community philanthropy. When she started that fund in the mid-90s, she didn't think, do I need actually a differences in difference regression analysis to actually analyze what I'm doing? Or do I need it to go out there and talk to women who can actually help me make this happen? So those are the kinds of choices where grassroots development really needs a different form of kind of thinking about how you learn and create, and that supports the movement that you're trying to develop, which was a completely universal finding across all the localities that we worked. So there is a sense in which we need both of those things, but we are not in the world giving sufficient priority to the principles of emergence, which takes me straight into Dipthi Manon, who I didn't know at the beginning of this process, and we seem to have operated in different kind of worlds, but yet I find here is a kindred spirit. Here is somebody doing actually what I dream of, which is actually using the principles of emergent learning as a way of doing a different kind of monitoring and evaluation, accountability and learning, as she will describe. So I'd like to actually introduce you, Dipthi, to say, tell us a little bit about you. Where are you? What do you do? And what's all this about? How did you get started on this?
Thanks, Barry. That's a very sweet introduction, and I like the comparison that you've drawn, that we've both converged after starting on different paths. I'm a journalist by training. I worked as a journalist till journalism burnt me out, but the storytelling skills that journalism gave me has stood me in good stead since. And I brought those skills to the development sector, and I started out with communication and storytelling, understanding grassroots activism and understanding women's rights sector. And then, as I continued and as I progressed, I chanced upon Urgent Action Fund Asia and Pacific, which was hardly a year into its existence. So Urgent Action Fund, to give you a brief, is a set of sister funds. So it actually began about over 30 years ago in the US. It was started by a set of fiery human rights activists who believed that feminist movement building and feminist activism and support for it is required. So we are rapid response funds, which means we offer emergency support to women and non-binary human rights defenders in times of crisis. So it started in the US, then it moved to Urgent Action Fund Africa was set up, Latin America and the Caribbean, and then we call ourselves the youngest sister of the set of 4 sisters. So when I joined UAVNP, there was very clear understanding from the leadership that the current forms of monitoring and evaluation systems don't really serve the feminist movements and the feminist organizations that we work with, nor us as a team. So the co-leads who were there, they love to say, they were burnt by the system. They knew what wasn't working. So as we were starting out, they were very intentional that let's try and do something different, maybe have a feminist learning approach. And that's how we began experimenting with emergent strategies of Adrienne Maree Brown, and then emergent learning, which had gained a lot of prevalence within the US at that time. It's still coming into, there are very few practitioners across our part of the world, but what we instinctively realized is it was a value-based system that could beautifully match with the feminist values that we were working with. So we started with experimenting with it. We got some money to set up a monitoring and evaluation framework. And what we wanted to ensure was we were not falling into the trap of building a quasi-log frame. And it took us a couple of years to understand where we were going wrong, because there was a lot of unlearning to do along the journey. But by 2020, I think we had a breakthrough. And the story since then is what has been captured in our feminist learning approach, which is what I would love to, expand further on with you today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Deepthi. So one of the things which really struck me was when I read your materials, which I think are wonderful and really helpful, and written in such a way that could be used much more extensively than perhaps we might imagine at this point, because I think many of the people on this call would benefit from having a look at those. But the thing that really struck me was that you started with your principles, that there was a lens through which you were looking at the world, a transformative lens, so that this wasn't just a technocratic exercise. You were pitching yourself about actually changing systems from a particular feminist angle. And then you had this notion, as you quite rightly say, of enormous complexity, so that there are many interacting factors that impinge on your work, some of them helpful, many of them harmful and difficult. But so that you've got a relatively small program of work with high principles and high contestation, high difficulty in terms of achieving your goals. How has the system helped you to bridge that gap between the enormous complexity of the task you face and the very clear principles that you've set yourselves? Does that help it to have that perspective, and if so, how?
I think most organizations, and especially grassroots organizations, what I think all of us have in common is that common set of values that guide us, the reason why we exist. And I think as a feminist rapid response fund, that was one of the first things that we were clear about naming. What is it that we want to ensure that we stick to, so that when in times of crisis or conflict, or even in terms of when you need affirmation, you know what your core values are, what your North Stars are, as we referred to it. So among them were trust building, nurturing relationships. It was about understanding our privilege as a funder and being able to redistribute that power. So these are not, I find them as foundational values that guide a lot of organizations who have not complicated it. by thinking of bigger systemic goals that they're going after. But I think these are basic human values that, stand each of us in good stead. So it started from there. We were very intentional of making this a learning approach. We were very intentional about having a learning organization where the monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning framework that we built served not just the donors who were giving us money, but also the movements we were working with, and more importantly, our core ecosystem, which is the team, the board, and the grantee organizations that we are working with. So what emergent learning helped us to do is, it helped us take out that worry of failure, because we started with using questions as a way of anchoring ourselves. What would it take? And every program had specific hypothesis, which was their way of answering the bigger organizational learning question. So the moment it became a question, the moment it became a journey, we realized that the next thing we need to tackle is build the internal team culture and a muscle so that we could collectively engage in that inquiry. A lot of times, and in my previous organizations as well, what we have realized is there's a lot of siloed working that happens, because people understand what they're doing, but they don't really want to know what other people are doing, because that complicates or that expands their work. When you create spaces where everybody comes, talks about their work, not just as what we have achieved, which is usually what those indicator models lead to, but also in terms of what are the challenges that we are facing. Does anybody within the team have lived experiences to support, hey, come up with examples of, hey, in my previous organization, this has happened, this is how we've tackled it. Sometimes all you need is an example that gives you the route or the path forward. So we lean back to our collective instinct of problem solving, rather than say that, we will wait for rigorous data to emerge at the end of 3 years, and only at the end of 3 years will we decide whether we've been on the right course or not. So we've trained ourselves and the team to lean into our instincts and be prepared to shift our hypothesis or shift the paths that we take within the program. And I think that flexibility and that ability to bring the team together were two things which I would say have been the mantra that's worked for us.
Interesting, Deepthi. I mean, that points to a really rather profound culture shift in the language of evaluation, which tends to be rather cold and data driven. But what you use the word instinct, you use the word intuition, you're beginning to think in creative categories, which is not normally the preserve of kind of thinking about monitoring and evaluation. You're also thinking about immediacy. So there's a clear practical dimension to this, which is how do we actually make progress? And it's really interesting. You talk about silos, but a very common framing question that the Global Fund uses is, what would it take to? Because that gives you an overall frame for which you can put various subcategories under. You can say, well, what would it take to shift this, or what would it take to shift that? So you're beginning to kind of go into really quite specific ways of advancing the field that you're helping to emerge. Have you had any pushback from any of your donors? Have they felt that this is a bridge too far for them, or have they, are they open-minded, or what's their attitude?
No, actually, we have been able to convince them to come along the path of experimentation with us. I think they were also excited by the fact that we believe strongly that there is an alternate way possible. And when we say alternate approach, it does not mean that we are not collecting data. We are also collecting data. As a rapid response fund, we have a database. It's a custom database. We are not using softwares that exist primarily because of the security and confidentiality issues of what we work with. But we have built an instinctive system that allows us to collect the data that we currently think we need, so that we are in charge of what are the indicators we are monitoring. And these indicators have been built on what funders usually ask us. What we usually don't give them are data on who our grantee is. We redact information and offer it. So we have built systems around what would be, conventional log frame asks. So I'll give you an example, for instance. Because we redact information, usually finance departments in most nonprofit organizations are usually seen as the ones holding the accountability line, where they do not take any risks. They try and ensure that there is high level of compliance to ensure that the audits are clean. We have never had a bad audit. We have always got clean audits, with a finance team that takes a lot of risks on behalf of defenders. We have been moving money into Afghanistan. We have been moving money into Myanmar. We have been doing things that other bigger organizations have been struggling with. And that actually points to a team which is able to be flexible, collectively think together. So what we do in times of a crisis, Barry, is not look at what are the processes that we can't move. In fact, what we come together and look at is what are the lived experiences that people sitting in this room have that we can harness, or who are the contacts or who are the networks that we can bring in to support us in thinking through what we need to do in a situation like this. We have been in multiple situations where the crises have not been something that we could have forecasted, or something that we would have pre-decided with donors that in case a crisis like this happens, this is how we are going to respond. So donors actually have been pretty flexible. In fact, we've had big bilateral donors who've moved into a partnership model with us to better understand how they can work, within this system. So I think it's about the language and the conviction that you have in what you're trying to do, and it's possible.
Yeah. And it's a both and. It's not a rejection of one system in favor of another. It's actually an enhancement of something which actually gives people what they need. I'm going to bring people into this discussion in a little while. So please do post questions in the chat and I will take account of them. And when we've finished, when Deepthi and I have finished our conversation, which will be pretty soon, you'll have a chance to contribute, put your hand up in the normal way, and I'll get to you, and we can build this conversation out. But there's one thing I do want to ask you, which I really love about your work, is your use of the term huddle. What's a huddle and how does it work?
So one of the things that we realized is very important is naming things so that there's language, there is common language built around it. And with emergent learning system, all of us who came into UAVNP had a lot of unlearning to do, a lot of baggage to shed on how we worked before. So that's where I was talking about how we began with, there being silos. So people would come into, reflection meetings or meetings where, we are thinking of what's the way forward with kind of like boxing gloves on. It's like, excuse me, stay off my turf. And we realized that this was coming about because people were unsure of what these spaces were going to be. So we started with naming them, and huddles just felt as an intimate, safe space for conversations to happen. So we have different rhythms in which we reflect. Emergent learning system offers a brilliant cycle, which is very nonlinear, of how you think of your work, which is you plan, you experiment, you reflect, you sense make, and you adapt. It does not mean that after planning, you're not reflecting, or after, experimenting, you don't immediately go into a sense-making mode. But having it named out really helped. So every 6 months, we have a breakdown to breakthrough huddle. And it was named because at a 6-month stage, what we realized most people wanted was either affirmation that we were going in the direction that we, set out at the beginning of the year, or they needed support to think through what are the challenges we are sitting on and how do we need to move so that by the end of the year, we are at least sailing in the direction that we want to. So we started with that, and we realized that even with a change in the language, the attitude with which people came into the meeting became about curiosity. It broke down barriers of, jargons that existed. And I think it helped all of us see the human behind, the numbers that were being thrown up. So that's the story of the huddle. So at 6 months, we do a breakdown to breakthrough huddle. And at the end of the year, before we go into work planning, we do a where we are at huddle. So that, these are the two clear calendar points that we try and never miss.
Thank you so much, Deepthi. You've really stimulated so many thoughts in my brain that it's hard to get them all out. But people are beginning to put questions into the chat, so I'm going to widen the discussion out now. Cher, you've put a really interesting question in the chat. Would you like to come online and unmute yourself and pose it? And then Dorcas, you've got a question I'd like you to ask too, since you've put it in the chat. Cher, are you there?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Sorry, yeah, you were muted. Yeah, gotcha.
That seems to be the Zoom thing. You have to say, do you hear me yet?
Oh yeah, we have to go through these rituals.
Yes.
But we can hear you fine, so please.
So thank you. I really enjoy learning about new distinctions, and I see this as very useful. I'm just thinking through, my organization is over 100 people, and we claim to want to be a learning organization. And the things that we're running into are, at some stage, the size requires the systems that add barriers to flexibility. And frankly, the emergent learning becomes more of a nice to have versus it just becomes difficult to generate space for it because there's just layers of policies. So I'm just curious, your thoughts on, I can see this working really well for smaller orgs. And as you grow, how do you maintain that culture, or how do you maintain the direction of flexibility, I guess, or orientation as an organization scales?
Thank you, Cher. That's a great question, and Deepthi. Then we'll go to Dorcas, and then we'll go to Ava. Okay, Dorcas. Oh, sorry, Deepthi. So yeah. So
I'll answer that. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Sure, we started with 8 people. During the peak of Afghanistan crisis, we were at 18, and now we are at a stable 16. Every year we are growing. But I understand what you're saying, but what I would say in situations like this is emergent learning is not easy. There's a lot of documentation. There's a lot of personal transformation that it seeks from every single team member. And that's a commitment that we do based on the feminist values that we've agreed to work with, that we will work on ourselves to be the more, receptive, introspective, reflective people. So initially, it was very difficult, even with a team of 8 people. So I would say, if one department changes, that change then snowballs into more departments changing. For us, it took 3 years for us to identify where we were starting with a quasi log frame. We said we are ditching the log frame, but what we initially started out with was almost a quasi log frame. And then we realized why these silos were forming, because people were not able to communicate with each other or feel safe to have honest discussions. So then we began building that internal team culture where safety was prioritized over content. So it was not about whether we were measuring right, but it was about, can we have language for safe conversations? As that began building, we started seeing that our huddles became much easier to ideate and implement. And this actually started as smaller experiments. So we tried it in team meetings. Then we tried changing the agenda, making people enthusiastic about coming in, adding in volunteers from different departments. So usually what happens is program teams get to speak all the time. HR and other functions feel like, they don't really have much to contribute. We tried flipping all of those. So, and now I have one of our consultants in this call as well, Karen. We've tried to do that for the entire sisterhood. So the sisterhood model, we've been trying to build a culture of changing it into an inquiry-based model of collective monitoring and evaluation. And it's not like it's smooth sailing, but when there is intent and you have a smaller experiment that's worked, then as long as there is commitment to stick on to it, I think it's possible, Cher.
Sure, I see you nodding your head. Does that satisfy you? I mean, does that a useful answer for you?
Yes, thank you. Yes, yeah. Thank you so much.
Deepthi, I think you've used the word culture so many times now. And if we're going to move from a traditional model of monitoring and evaluation, which is based largely on transaction, to one which is based up much deeper on what you're suggesting towards transformation, we are going to have to change in that process. So culture change goes part and parcel, I think, of what you're really saying, because that goes deeper. That's what communities want. They want to understand the depth and the complexity and the nuance of what is going on there, which often transactional models of measuring things, and it hurts me to say that because that's all statistics can ever do, and that's where I trained. We need to kind of go deeper. Dorcas, you made a really interesting question in the chat. Would you like to unmute yourself and tell us what it is? Where are you?
Thank you so much. My name is Dorcas Mugala. I work with Tips South Africa and I'm in Uganda. So this conversation is very important for me because we are on a journey to rethink how we do our M&E. And as I was listening in, I got so many interesting insights. And I would like to know how they were able to maintain consistency in tracking their outcomes with the flexibility incorporated and allowing staff and the beneficiaries to share experiences at different times. How do you then get those experiences and track them over time in a consistent way without putting standards that the log frame brings about? I would like to hear something more on that, on the common language and naming things. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. Thank you.
So what we did was we tried keeping it as simple as possible, because even the facilitators, even my mentors who I was working with, who were accompanying me on the process of developing this learning approach on emergent learning, they were also experimenting with it. So what we leaned into is what we intuitively knew could work for the team. This required a lot of conversations. It wasn't easy to do, but we stuck with things that seemed to work with people. So for instance, I'll give you a small example. We have 4 key questions that we track as part of our monitoring and evaluation approach. 4 key organizational goals have 4 key learning questions, which are anchored in the feminist values. And each of these questions address a different pillar of our strategy, if to use a jargon that you and I would understand. in each, so the first question, so everybody looked at it and said, oh, the first question has to be a grant making question because we are a rapid response fund. The second question is on resource mobilization. The third question is on comms and knowledge building. And the fourth question is on internal team culture, which it wasn't. So the first question, we renamed it as our bread and butter question. Why bread and butter? Because it was something all of us had to do as part of the key specialization that we brought into the work that we did. So I, as the knowledge facilitator, had to be responsible for one hypothesis of the key learning question. Similarly, resource mobilization had one. All the different parts of my fund had a hypothesis which answered to that big bread and butter question. So bread and butter has now become bread and butter question. Which question does it answer to? The bread and butter question. That's our language that we developed. Like earlier, I was talking to Barry about huddles. Huddles have become a common term. So building those safe spaces where we built our own language and we knew our definition for collaboration has changed, Dorcas, over a period of the last 3 years. Collaboration is not one team being accountable and responsible for organizing something and others providing their technical support as and when needed. A collaboration means if there is a convening happening, there are at least 3 teams which have equal stake in it, which means accountability is shared, which means success is shared. So the success becomes of each of us rather than, one individual person shining. And that has been a form of collective care for us as well. So we've been trying to incorporate language of care, language of, what we commonly use so that it rolls off the tongue faster. And those have been a few of the things that we've been doing. What we have insisted on is documentation. All of us have different ways of documenting. All of us have different ways of recollecting what has happened. So the only few rules that we have in place is every quarter, you need to have an individual reflection, a reflection with your close team members on how your quarter is going. And finally, in a team meeting, we come to uplift the key themes that are emerging. So for instance, the last 2 years, it's been about the pandemic or it's been about our Afghanistan crisis response. This year, we have pivoted our Afghanistan response, which means that, our priorities have changed, which means we need to look at what are the strategies that are now informing what we are doing. So this is the level of awareness that exists at a granular level, Dorcas, when we are talking about using a more emergent, more responsive system. We are not waiting till 6 months to give you data on where we are at right now. There is a reflection every quarter. And for a couple of years, I didn't insist that everybody keep a learning log. And then we realized that people were not keeping it. So then we put in that exercise into the prep that goes into the huddle. So we've been trying to meet people where they are rather than enforce things on them, which, then builds in resistance. And I think creating those kind of approaches have been where we have succeeded so far.
Thank you, Deepthi. Eva wants to probe a bit more about the ingredients of the culture change, which I think everybody really will be really kind of in awe of the way you're approaching that. So Eva, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, and just maybe to add to that, I think it's so immensely inspiring, and thank you for sharing that learning is really the driver here, right? And not just a sort of, then we'll also get to learning, which I think, a lot of what you said really resonates in terms of being values and principles driven in it. And then I'm wondering about, how do you actually help people with this unlearning process? And what strikes me is that it sounds to me like you have a really high political and values alignment already as you were going into it. And is that one of the key ingredients that we need? And, maybe other recommendations that you have that really helped you specifically also with this unlearning part? Thank you.
So yeah, the unlearning part is also linked to individual transformation. So there's always been an incentive given for all of us to have learning questions, personal learning questions on what would we like to do in our work. As we started off on that, we realized that people found it much easier to frame an organizational learning question than a personal learning question. Because if you're doing a personal learning question, then you're challenging yourself to admit things you don't want to see in yourself. So for a culture of learning, what we realize we need to do is we need to create that safe space where if people say that I need a day off because I'm sick, everybody's saying, take that time off. You will feel better when you come back. You will be able to do, you will be able to get your work done. So it's a simple message where you're not worried about, messaging your coworker saying, I don't think I can be productive today because, I have my periods. It's not something that will work for me. To be able to be seen and, accepted for what you are helps a lot. And it's not been easy, Eva, to be honest. It's taken a lot of reflections. It's taken a lot of working with facilitators who've been trying to offer coaching in terms of what should be team culture. How do we stand up? How do we speak up? How do we show up for each other? But all of this, along with our emergent learning system, have worked in tandem. So I think what we have managed to do in 4 years, would be like it's a brief period of time if you look at the time that people take in terms of their learning culture. But I think what has worked for us is we didn't start with learning the technicality of tools and then implementing it. We rather looked at tools as, what is it telling us? What is at the heart of it? What would using this tool really help us get to? Will this make our thinking clearer? So, understanding the principles behind it instead of blindly using tools, which honestly, I think is where half of us fail, especially in the nonprofit sector. We come in, we inherit tools. We don't ask the questions on why are we using these tools. We just blindly use it. And, we try and answer questions as possible without actually refining our thinking around why are we doing it. Is that resonating?
Eva, did you get what you wanted from that?
Yeah, and I'm just so in awe of what you've done, and I'm really looking forward to diving into your report as well to learn more. Thank you for sharing.
Do dive into the report, Eva. There's a lot to be gained from there. And it's interesting you should mention that we've gone into the tools because we've got an interesting question here, I think, which takes us deeper into this from Shweta, who's asking about the huddles. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions, Shweta?
Thanks, Barry. Dipti, as usual, fantastic listening to you. So during the huddles, I'm sure you have some kind of semi-structure. You talked about learning logs. Can you tell us all about learning log as well as bars and Rs that you will use?
Yeah, it's so I would say BARs and AARs are the only tools that you really need to work with and practice with. So BAR is a before action review and an AAR is an after action review. And this can be done in multiple ways. So a before action review, to put it simplistically, is getting your thinking clear on why are you doing a convening, an experiment. It could be used for anything. It is like 5 to 6 simple questions on what is the experiment, what do you expect to see out of it, what do you think are the challenges, what can be done to work around the challenges, and where are you going to try and do it. So these are like, it seems simple, but when we start writing it, initially people would write like it was a school test. They'd write two answers, two things against it. And that's when we realized that the heart of the BAR is not in writing it down, but in actually bringing all those people who will be involved in that experiment together to be able to have a discussion around it. So as you're discussing, you suddenly realize that the heart of the question has changed, because 5 of us read the same question in 5 different ways. And that diversity itself adds to the richness of that discussion. And by the end of the discussion, if you're leaving that room energized about what you're going to do, then half your challenge is won. And that's what we've been trying to do. So we do the BAR. At the end of everything, we do a debrief, which is the after action review. So initially, the error that we did was we got people to fill it out like a form. And then we realized, hello, we're again, perpetuating a template, which is not the purpose. So even learning logs have the very same questions written in a different way. So people take their hypothesis, and the learning logs are based on the same BAR principles of, BAR and AAR principles. So it's an AAR, the learning log, which that's how I just changed it around, so that every quarter you're already taking a top line out. In the quarter, you're looking at what are the 3 stories that stand out. And then you're actually going into the granular details of what are those 3 stories. Once that is done, for every huddle, there is a team which sits together. We always ensure there are external facilitators who can ask curious questions, so that we are not sitting and wallowing in our own successes or, crying over our failures, but there's somebody coming in and reframing it for us in a manner of speaking. And when that's done, so once you have the learning logs, you're not sitting with your learning log and bringing that to the huddle. You're already having 2 rounds of refining your thinking and reflecting on what's happened. So a more evolved sense making has happened before you come into the huddle. And each huddle, what we try and do is we don't have the same template. You don't know what you're coming into. You don't know what questions are being asked. All you know is, I know my part of the story. And in that huddle, together, we try and piece together what the elephant looks like. And that's when we realize there are a lot of aha moments that are happening. People realize that they actually contributed to something much bigger than what their work would show them, in their personal reflections. And I think those are the most rewarding moments. Those are the moments of connection that you form. And that makes your approach more robust than any robust indicators that can be framed. And I can wager that, my approach would stand with, any other approaches out there.
That's a really interesting reply, Deepthi, and you've just struck a chord in my mind, which is, when we think about you, not only are you doing real-time sense making, you're using data in a way that is so rarely used, which is often particularly external analysts like me come in and they do an analysis, but what you're saying is you do a synthesis. So if you're using data to create a model from the experience of everyone involved, and also road testing that perceptions with external people, so you're not simply self-reinforcing your own perceptions, you're actually coming up with something new, which is the heart of emergence. So this is really methodologically very impressive, and we should be lifting this kind of process up, because although I said analysis on the traditional model has got its value, it very rarely prepares us for what happens on Monday, what happens next for an organization, which is where, when we're thinking about disasters, we don't know where they're coming from next, because we had COVID, and then we had the economic crisis, and then we've had something else, and now we've got something else. It's that compounding, in a sense, building resilience among the people to actually feel that they're capable of doing that, coping with that. And the other dimension, which is really coming across very strongly to me, is the power of safe space. I was talking with a senior American funder recently, and she said, I used to think that safe space was a sort of touchy-feely, kind of nice to have thing. But now I'm coming to see it's actually central to social transformation. We need our feelings, the way we are as people, and how we behave in human groups is actually central to transformation. And we cannot just be technocratic about that. And it follows that our evaluations and our learning cannot just be technocratic. There are technocratic dimensions to this, but it's, you know, it's really important. Next question. There's nothing in the chat. Who would like to speak? Do jump up. I'm sure that this is stimulating. Anybody kind of would like to offer an opinion or just say where they are, how they feel about this kind of conversation, things they've learned, things they'd like to ask. Anything else?
Yeah, I have a
yeah, Eshban, go.
Yeah, you know, Deepthi had mentioned earlier that despite widespread dissatisfaction, this is part of the conversation that had happened in the morning, that despite widespread dissatisfaction, there's still the question of confidence and courage, which is the courage to ask to do things differently, the courage to actually go ahead and do things differently, because every time you try to experiment, there is a certain amount of courage that is required for that process. Deepthi, I don't know if you could just say something about that, because I think that for many of us, we have these thoughts and ideas of experimenting with different forms of measuring, but there is something to be said about finding the courage to go ahead and do it.
God, that's a tricky question, Ashwan. There, you know, where do you find courage to do it? I would, you know, at UAV ANP, and I think at the sisterhood level, the Urgent Action Funds level, there has been, I think it's the courage comes from setting an intention that we will try and do it differently. And then if you can bring in that collective lived experiences of people to figure out how can we do this differently. I think even finding courage can be a learning question, you know, because it requires a sort of transformation. If there are people who are not naturally geared towards seeking something for themselves, claiming space, a lot of our communities, they're not, they don't claim the space that they should. You know, whether when we are negotiating with a donor, we end up agreeing to all the terms of the donor, even if it goes against, you know, what our values or, you know, what our ethics say, because it's required to run the organization. But perhaps we need to encourage more conversations to happen in and work from that abundance mindset that, you know, there are people, you can find allies on the other side as well. I have often gone into meetings, you know, especially with bilateral donors, etc., thinking they're inflexible. This is what I've heard all the time. You know, they're inflexible, their monitoring and evaluation systems are so rigorous, they don't give an inch. But once you show them the stories, once you show them that there is a lot of work that's happened on the ground, it's not totally allied to the indicators that you have, could we tweak it a different way? And then you have very powerful stories emerging. There's always the room to listen. And I think we all need to hone our listening skills so that we are listening to understand and not to respond, you know. So I think it works from all ends, you know, while we feel that, I think it's a power dynamic that makes us feel that, you know, donors don't listen or donors don't understand. I think there could be a way of challenging that. And the work needs to begin with us first.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think there's another dimension to this, which you've already touched on, Deepthi, which is the language of monitoring and evaluation is so terrifying sometimes that it puts people off, and they're frightened of slipping up, of making a mistake, of getting something you know, in the wrong place. The category. You know, I mean, having trained as a statistician, you know, words like eigenvalue crop up, and you know, you drop the word eigenvalue into a conversation, you don't make many friends, I can tell you that. And it you know, it creates a climate of fear, and we should be actually, what I love about your work is that you, as I think Ava pointed out, is it gives priority to learning, because that's what we need, learning and action. It's very practical. So who'd like to offer a thought or suggestion or anything? We've still got a bit of time if you want to. Oh yes, Niyama, yeah. I hope I've got your name right.
It's Neve.
No, name. Okay.
It's okay. I just want to say thank you very much, Deepthi. I found it really, really interesting. And even if some of it makes my head hurt a little bit, because we're conditioned to be compliant, and we're conditioned to learn and to do things in a certain way. And particularly, you know, through logical frameworks and you know, results frameworks and results-based management systems, we're trained to think in a particular way, and those systems and frameworks, sometimes, regardless of how much you disagree with them, and you know that life doesn't happen in straight lines, it still provides a framework and a system that can guide you, that you have to comply with, and that that can guide you along a certain path. And I think what Eshwan said, it does take real courage to step out of that and to challenge it and to try and think differently. You know, and as I listened to you, I was thinking, okay, I'm listening and I'm thinking, okay, so we've got logical frameworks or results frameworks, and you're trying to get as you're speaking, I'm picturing in my head, you know, these boxes and this framework, and I'm trying to fit what you're saying into this box, because that's your natural inclination, is to try and fit it into those boxes, but it doesn't fit, and it doesn't need to fit. And it suddenly struck me halfway through is that, you know, I work in a university, and don't shoot me, but I do teach results-based management, but I teach it from a critical perspective, and I advocate for participation and true participation in teaching it. If I have to teach it, I'll try to be a devil's advocate in my approach to teaching it. But what struck me is that, you know, when you're looking at that data and data collection, and you're looking at indicators, there's so much that they don't tell you. How something happened, why something happened, how people approached it, what they learned, you know, all of the things, you know, the qualitative things that the data doesn't capture. And that's what I heard from you talking, and I think that's the really important stuff that is going to make change, that is going to be transformative. So you've challenged me this afternoon. You've certainly challenged me, but I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
That's amazing to hear, Neve. Thank you so much.
That's I mean, I have to confess, I quite like log frames because they do give you a logical framework, and you know, there is a path you can kind of think from A to B through and see what are the hurdles, what are the things you need to kind of overcome, what would the results look like. That's a very good discipline, I think, to actually put before a mind. I think where it goes wrong is if we use that planning framework also as the only evaluation framework. It's that, you know, when you see it as a monopoly, that it becomes problematic, because we know, you know, life never proceeds along a straight path, and there are always going to be deviations and routes. And you know, the principle of you know, the systems theory shows that the solution to any problem has to be more complex than the problem itself, so that when we're dealing with, as Deepthi is, with multiple conflicting issues of disasters that are coming out of nowhere and can't be predicted, it's inevitable that we need a different kind of system. It doesn't mean that we can't do any planning and we can't think about that, but it's, you know, it's like the old story about when when a performance indicator becomes a target, it ceases to be a performance indicator. That in a sense we conflate success with actually following the plan, as if the plan has some kind of sacrosanct. So I think it's a both and situation. I don't think, I think we need to, any tool has to know its limits, otherwise you start trying to saw wood with garden spades. It doesn't actually work too well. Dorcas, you've got another question which I think is a good one. Would you like to say that? Ask that. And Wendy's put a useful comment in the chat, which people might like to read. Dorcas.
Thank you so much. So I have been reflecting about the database earlier mentioned, where they keep some track of some of the information. And I'm wondering how now this information is brought together with that that is shared during the hurdles and the reflections, to kind of like merge it together to come up with the practical changes that have been observed, or keeping track of the outcomes that that have come up during the reflections and those that are in the database. And then also our thinking about how in practice they have been able to collect this information in different spaces without overburdening the team. And there are some examples of best practices of how you can pick up this information without necessarily sending tools that have to be filled in, like those tools that people feel that are overburdening them to always respond and send in information. Thank you.
So Dorcas, our database that we built was largely built on the information that donors require. So, it has information on country-wise, segmentation. It has regional information. It has issue-based information on what we are, granting. So these are all basic information that we would, even put it into an Excel sheet. So I think from 2018 to nearly 2020, we had all of this on Excel sheets because the number of grants were smaller and we were building this database. And then we, shifted to the database. Because we are a rapid response fund, that level of quantitative data gathering is very important. But I would also recommend that it needs to be done because numbers also tell a story which we cannot discount. And that story is as important as the nuance that we bring in by looking at how did it happen, why did it happen, and who were responsible for what happened. So once we have the data stories, there are some teams which are more data-driven storytellers than others. So for instance, the grants team would definitely bring in data saying we've disbursed X number of grants to X number of countries, and those are information that they have at their fingertips thanks to the database. One thing we have decentralized is monitoring and evaluation is not something that I as a person, I as a learning facilitator am responsible for. The resource mobilization facilitator and the grants facilitators have these numbers with them. So what we realize is usually what happens is teams don't talk to each other. Everyone has their own individual ways of collecting data and keeping it. So these huddles are the places where we bring in our data and look at how different data sets are talking to each other. And what's the story emerging when we overlay one data set on the other? So when we say that we've given grants to 19 countries, what we are then looking at is which are the regions that are missing out? Why are they missing out? Why are we not able to increase our grant making in those regions? I'm giving you a specific example from my context in this case, but I feel that data also gives us a key insight into things that we can tweak within our processes. So then it's not about what are we doing to reach the targets, but how can we tweak our processes, or how can we strengthen our thinking so that there can be different results at the end of the next quarter. So we literally have thinking which is quarter based, and there are multiple times when teams meet, which are then opened up to other team members depending on need. So if there is a donor report coming up and we need certain information from, say, the grants team or other teams, we usually call for a meeting together, and we sit and discuss all the questions and see who is best placed to answer those questions. So it's never the onus of one team member to be able to furnish all the information. And I see that as a huge issue sometimes in organizations where it's the monitoring and evaluation person who's always crunching numbers, sometimes without having the context of where, what were the decisions that went behind certain numbers looking the way they are. And I think this adds to the burden of team members as well. So once you know your story, once you know what your role has been in the story, then I feel that most of our huddles have been spaces where people said, oh, I didn't realize that's how that worked. Or, people felt comfortable to say, so why were you working on this part of the story? So when you have that curiosity and when you have that ability to engage, I think all of this falls into place.
Thanks. It sounds like a really powerful team builder, if nothing else. Robin, you put a question in the chat. Would you like to ask it?
Thanks so much. I think, Deepthi, you've answered my question to some degree already. I asked how much does quantitative data actually inform your huddles and your BARs and your AARs? Just to give bit of my background, I specialize in setting up dashboards, which are of course very much informed by quantitative data that has been collected by various team members. And a big learning for me was we set up these dashboards that go out every week, and we're kind of making the assumption that everyone was looking at the dashboards and learning what they needed to from them. But the big learning has been
Robin, I think you need to take your camera off. We can't hear you.
What those dashes
Robin, we've lost you.
Can't hear me.
No.
How's that? Sorry, we have load shedding here.
You were saying that you constructed a lot of dashboards, but proper dashboards. Okay, try again. You've taken your camera off. It might work now.
Apologies. In South Africa, we have power cuts.
No, we're not
getting
getting
our connectivity. So I think I should be fine now. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, go quick. Try.
Hello,
go
good.
for it.
Yay. Okay, sorry about that.
That's all right.
So did you get any of what I said?
You were saying you're building dashboards, and we lost it from the but.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we were making the assumption, I think, that teams were using the data from their dashboards to inform their practice and to have their own discussions. And I'm a consultant. I work with NGOs, 2 days a month. And what we really were realizing is we needed to come together as a team to reflect on what the dashboards were actually telling us. And that's where the biggest learning has been. But listening to you talk, I think there's questions that need to be asked beyond the quantitative data as well. And maybe that question of what are we learning, what are we feeling on an intuitive or an instinctual level is actually happening that maybe this data isn't telling us, or does it meet? I suppose the question I'm wanting to ask is, to what degree does the data inform your discussions, and versus this is our intuitive or instinctual experience? that we're learning from versus what we're learning from our quantitative data?
I'll start the answer, and I really want to bring in Karen, who I see, and Karen's been part of the consultant team that devised the sister funds monitoring and evaluation framework. Data has always been the starting point because it's easier to rally people around a strong data story. X number of grants given across X countries. It's a proud moment for a small grant maker as our grant numbers increase. But there are multiple stories within the stories as to why is there an increase across one region as against other. And these are questions that the board also asks us, So each time new consultants come in, they give us a new way of, or a new prism of looking at what kind of data can we look at. And so I'll give you an example. So one of the questions that we ask in our reports is, how much did the grant help you feel safe? So what we realized that in regions, both Asia and the Pacific, where English is not your first language, a lot of grantees were using what they said in the grant proposal to respond as answers. So yes, did the grant make you feel safe? Yes, the grant made us feel safe. So my data tells me 100% of my grantees felt safe after getting the grant. How much will I believe my data? And then you come to the nuance that, once I start talking to them with translators or getting them on a call or on the sidelines of, a convening, is when the true story emerges as to what the grant did. And oftentimes we realize that what the grant did is give them that flexibility with their resources. They might not have used the grant money at the time for the purpose that the grant was given. They use that money to roll. It's an important insight for us to understand the people that we are working with, but no indicator helps you, catch that. So that's something that gets lost. Karen, do you want to reflect on how we've tried using data to start conversations?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And it's great to see Dipti share. So yeah, just to give a little background. So myself and another consultant named Caroline Lampert, the two of us were hired by the sister funds, the Urgent Action Fund, the consortium of sisters, to help them develop a meal framework for their consortium. And I think exactly what, and so my background, actually, just to give a little bit sense, is I started off working in for the US government in a donor position, very quantitatively trained too. And so my thinking around MEL has really evolved, and really understanding, yes, quantitative data is great at some level if you're really trying to think through trying to understand the program and what type of impact it's making. It really needs to be coming from and hearing from and driven by those in the community, and really around who you're trying to support. And so I've really shifted in terms of going from a quantitative to really mixed method. And I think to the question that was just posed earlier, what Dipti was saying is that, I think, as a starting point, having some information or data to start from is where you want to start the conversation, because that is easier to reflect back on. And from there, in the work that we've done with the sister funds, we have looking at starting with those data is trying to understand what resonates, what does that information tell us, what doesn't it tell us, and really coming back to this information around this idea of what data really matters. One thing that I always talk through with the organizations that we're working from is what is it the information that you need to know versus what's good to know, and really trying to fine tune and focus on what is it that you really need to know, and why do you need to know that information, and for what purpose and for what cause. And so we've had, it's been a 2.5-year journey that we had with the sister funds, going through and developing the meal framework. And I think just, really trying to understand and whittle down, and it's been a series of mini experiments or pilot testing, trying to understand what is it that you want to focus on, or what is it that's really most important, and who needs to be brought in. And we had our own version of a collective sense making with the sister funds, and we really tried to make sure that we brought in various different voices from those that represent different parts of the sister funds to talk through and offer their perspective. And so I think in thinking through the data, it helped us lead to, I feel like I'm going a little bit roundabout way of explaining, but yeah, I think that, there's value for both quantitative and qualitative, and it's really trying to understand, it's really not whether it's quantitative or qualitative, but really trying to understand, focusing on what information is most important and how it will be used and for whom and why. And then if it's not getting the information that you want, then trying to tease that out and understand, okay, what additional information would be helpful and how to go about getting that, and making sure that those types of decision making is not being held to a select few, but it's really being able to bringing in the perspectives of those, I think, we think we like grant making. I think one of the discussions that we had during the collective sense making is that we ended up brought in a lot of those that came from the program office who were involved in the grant making, the program officers who we didn't invite or who weren't part of the collective sense making that we had were those that were involved in finance. And so more so the administrative side. And we realized during the collective sense making that, they're involved in administrating the grant as well and getting it, and they bring in a unique perspective. And so not having them there at the meeting, we felt was a missed opportunity. And so we've talked about how to make sure, and they don't always necessarily see themselves as a meal person, right? But they do bring an important perspective in there because they're the one that's helping to give out these emergency assistance funds. And they're also tracking a lot of really relevant information as well. And so being able to think through about how to pull them in and have their perspectives be part of the conversation as well as we're talking through the data. So
thanks, Karen.
Yeah.
Sorry for pulling you in like that.
No worries.
Thank you. I mean, I think the lesson I take from that is just as successful interventions need to be diverse and inclusive, so do data sources, that we need different kinds of data for different kinds of reasons, and we need to look at it through a practical and actually action-oriented transformational kind of perspective. And then that kind of way of processing will lead you towards a really interesting mix of solutions. So thank you, Deepthi. You've really stimulated an amazing discussion here, really advancing certainly my perspectives on stuff. And we're running out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Eshban so that he can conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Deepthi, and everybody else that has contributed to this conversation. I want to wrap up by saying that we acknowledge and realize that there's a lot of interesting things happening in different parts of the ecosystem, and we are quite eager to collect some of the stories of how people are measuring differently, and to take that and share that or feed that into our ecosystem. Like I said earlier, I think that courage and confidence is a significant part of this work And we think that sharing those stories and other attempts on other experiments of how people are measuring differently could collectively work to building courage and confidence. So that's it for me. I'm going to call in Jenny to just wrap it up in a nice bow with what she's seeing or feeling, and we'll probably share some thoughts on how to move forward.
Thanks, Eshban. Thank you, everybody. It's late, very late in the day for Deepti, who has to go to bed now. But Deepti, thank you so much, and thanks, Barry, for facilitating. I think so much that came out of this idea that we should use language to make meaning, not to obscure meaning. And I think we are really good in this sector at using technical language to exclude people and sort of elevate our own knowledge. I think putting this in the context of shift the power more broadly, it seems there are three strands here. One is reforming the existing system to not be so preoccupied by its rather narrow needs. The second is really celebrating the emergent system, where things are happening which are centered around communities and things that matter to them, that new practices are emerging, and how we're able to recognize and bring those in. And then I think the third is around the negotiation piece, which I put in the chat, but I think I was either Wendy or Eshban, around actually how do we use our collective muscle to start to negotiate a broader set of metrics, learning tools, or whatever you want to call them, that we could actually start to sort of trade, have proxy indicators, proxy types of learning that still work. I mean, that seems to be something that as a group we could really think about doing differently, because I think behind all of this is the issue of power. And it's not just about expanding what I think some would argue is already a rather broken system, but really actually embedding emergent ways of doing things that start from a different place altogether, as well as kind of rerouting some of the existing systems that we have. So for those of you who don't know, there's the Shift the Power Summit happening in Bogota in December, and this is certainly a learning thread that we would like to take forward with anyone on this call and within our own network. So we will certainly be reaching out to engage. I think Eshban's put his email address there too. But thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation. It's such a critically important one. And I was writing a report to a bilateral donor last week, and by the time I filled everything into the log frame, I just thought, that's not the story. It's like I've got this beautiful painting and I've cut it up into pieces, and now I'm not excited by this story. This isn't the work. And somehow that just feels so wrong, that is the final product of really complex, profound work that's happening on the ground and that needs to be made visible to others. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for Barry for facilitating, Eshban for setting us up, and you all for being here. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Rachel.